I was snowed in with my former bully. Then he asked me to stay close. Gay love story. Welcome back, everyone. Before we step into today's unforgettable story, I'd love to ask for one small favor. If you enjoy heartfelt romance and emotional storytelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It only takes a second, costs nothing, and it helps us continue creating meaningful stories filled with love, hope, and unforgettable moments. Your support truly means more than you know. And before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Leave your city or country in the comments below so we can welcome you. Thank you so much for being here. Now, let's return to the beginning of our story and meet the man whose life was about to change forever. Some storms trap you in the cold. The rare ones force you to face the person you've spent years trying to forget. I always believed that leaving my hometown meant leaving my past behind. 5 years had passed since graduation, and in those 5 years I had carefully built a quieter life. One where nobody knew the awkward teenager who flinched whenever laughter echoed down a hallway. Now I was Caleb Foster, an art instructor who traveled across Oregon teaching weekend watercolor workshops in small mountain communities. My students never asked about my high school years. They only cared whether the sky should be painted before the trees and whether snow reflected blue or silver. That was exactly the kind of life I wanted. Peaceful, predictable, safe. The weather forecast had mentioned light snowfall, nothing unusual for late January. So I loaded my SUV with canvases, brushes, folding easels, and enough coffee to survive the 3-hour drive. Around noon, the scenery transformed into a postcard. Towering pine trees were heavy blankets of white, frozen rivers shimmered beneath pale sunlight, and wooden cabins rested quietly beneath roofs dusted with fresh powder. It should have been beautiful. Instead, a strange uneasiness settled in my chest as the wind grew louder. Tiny snowflakes became thick curtains, swallowing the highway 1 mile at a time. Visibility dropped so quickly that the road ahead seemed to disappear into a wall of white. My hands tightened around the steering wheel while the tires crunched over fresh snow. The radio interrupted the music with an emergency weather bulletin warning travelers to seek shelter immediately. Before I could reach the next town, the engine coughed once, then twice. A warning light blinked across the dashboard. "Come on," I whispered, gently pressing the accelerator. The SUV answered with silence. It rolled to a stop beside a lonely stretch of forest road as snow drifted against the windows. I tried the ignition again and again, but the only response was a tired clicking sound. My phone showed 1 week bar before losing service completely. I leaned back against the seat and laughed under my breath, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes life seemed to enjoy ironic timing. 5 years of carefully avoiding unexpected detours, and now I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with a winter storm closing in. I pulled my coat tighter, stepped outside, and immediately felt the wind steal my breath. Snow stung my cheeks while the silence of the mountains felt almost unreal. Then, somewhere beyond the swirling white, headlights appeared. A dark green Forest Service truck emerged slowly through the storm, stopping a few yards away. Relief washed over me so quickly I almost forgot how cold I was. The driver's door opened, and a tall man climbed out wearing a ranger jacket, insulated boots, and a dark knit cap pulled low over his forehead. He looked older than the memories I carried, broader through the shoulders, quieter somehow. When he lifted his face, those familiar blue eyes met mine, and time folded in on itself. Logan Hayes, the boy who had once made every school day feel twice as long. The last person I ever expected to see standing between me and the worst snowstorm of the year. His expression shifted from professional concern to unmistakable recognition. For a long second, neither of us spoke. The wind howled through the trees, filling the silence that neither of us seemed ready to break. Finally, Logan glanced toward my disabled SUV before looking back at me, his voice calm, steady, and almost hesitant. "The highway's already closed. My cabin is the closest shelter. You're not making it out tonight." Logan waited without saying another word while I stood there pretending to weigh my options, as if there were any. Behind me, My SUV sat buried a little deeper every minute, and ahead of me the snowstorm erased the road until the entire world looked like an empty white canvas. Pride whispered that I should refuse. Common sense reminded me that frostbite did not care about old grudges. I finally nodded once. "Lead the way." Logan simply replied, "Stay close. The trail disappears fast in weather like this." Those 3 words caught me off guard. Stay close. Coming from anyone else, they would have sounded ordinary. Coming from the person I had spent years avoiding, they felt strangely unfamiliar. I climbed into the passenger seat of the Forest Service truck, brushing melting snow from my coat as warm air drifted from the vents. The cab smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and clean winter air. Everything inside was organized with quiet precision. A thermos rested beside folded maps. Work gloves hung neatly from the dashboard. A golden retriever smiled from a photograph clipped above the radio. I found myself staring at it longer than I intended. "His name was Scout," Logan said softly after noticing where I was looking. "He passed away last spring." There was no dramatic sadness in his voice, only the gentle ache people carried after loving something deeply. "I am sorry," I answered before I could stop myself. He thanked me with a small nod, and silence returned. It was not the hostile silence I remembered from high school hallways. It felt uncertain, as though neither of us knew what version of the other sat only a few feet away. 20 minutes later, we turned onto a narrow forest road lined with towering pines whose branches sagged beneath fresh snow. Nestled among them stood a modest log cabin with smoke curling from a stone chimney. It looked less like a ranger station and more like the kind of place people escaped to when they needed the world to slow down. Inside, warmth wrapped around me almost instantly. Fire crackled inside an old stone fireplace while soft amber light filled the living room. The cabin was simple but welcoming, with handmade shelves, framed landscape paintings, stacks of well-read books, and a quilt draped across the couch. Nothing about the place matched the loud, reckless teenager I remembered. Logan disappeared into the kitchen before returning with a steaming mug. "Hot chocolate," he said. "I figured you never liked coffee anyway." My fingers froze around the mug. I had forgotten that. Somehow he had not. I took a cautious sip while pretending his words meant nothing. The rich chocolate warmed my hands before it reached my chest. Outside, the wind slammed against the windows, rattling the glass hard enough to remind us both that leaving was no longer an option. Logan checked the weather radio, listening quietly before turning the volume down. "The county closed every road through the pass," he said. "It could be 2 or 3 days before crews clear enough snow for anyone to get through." 2 or 3 days. The number echoed in my mind louder than the storm itself. I glanced toward the hallway where only one bedroom door stood half open. Logan seemed to notice the same thing at the exact same moment. A faint, almost embarrassed smile crossed his face. "I have a pull-out couch," he said quickly. "You can have the bedroom." I looked at him, surprised by how naturally the offer came. 5 years ago, he would have laughed at my discomfort. Tonight he stepped aside without hesitation, giving me space as though my comfort actually mattered. I could not decide which version of Logan Hayes was harder to understand, the one from my memories or the man quietly placing another log on the fire while the snow continued burying the world outside. I barely slept that first night. The bedroom was warm, the quilt was heavier than the one I used back home, and the wind outside rose and fell like waves crashing against invisible cliffs. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same hallway from high school. Bright lockers, loud laughter, Logan standing at the center of it all. Memory had a cruel way of preserving emotions long after faces began to change. When morning finally arrived, pale winter sunlight filtered through frosted windows, turning the room's soft shades of silver and gold. I stepped into the kitchen expecting awkward silence, but instead found fresh pancakes waiting on the table beside a small bottle of maple syrup. Logan stood at the stove flipping another one with surprising concentration. He looked over his shoulder and offered a polite smile. "Good morning. I was not sure what you liked anymore, but pancakes seemed like a safe choice." The simple sentence caught me off guard. Not because of the breakfast, but because he had quietly acknowledged that people could change. I thanked him, and we ate while listening to the weather radio announce another full day of road closures. Conversation stayed light. We talked about the mountain trails, the local elk population, and the elementary school where I would have taught my workshop if the storm had not arrived. Neither of us mentioned high school. It sat between us anyway, as visible as the snow piled against every window. After breakfast, Logan pulled on his winter coat. "I need to clear some snow before it freezes solid." "You do not have to help." I hesitated for a second before grabbing the spare shovel leaning beside the door. The air outside was sharp enough to make every breath visible. Together we carved narrow paths through drifts nearly 3 feet deep. The work was slow, almost peaceful. No music, no forced conversation. Just the steady rhythm of shovels scraping across packed snow. Every now and then Logan glanced toward me, not to judge, but to make sure I was keeping warm. It was such a small gesture that I almost missed it. Around noon we returned inside with cold cheeks and damp gloves. Logan placed a kettle on the stove while I wandered through the living room, studying the shelves more closely. There were guidebooks about wildlife, photography magazines, woodworking manuals, and several sketchbooks stacked neatly beside the fireplace. One lay open on the coffee table. Curious, I looked down and froze. The pages were filled with pencil drawings of mountain landscapes, old cabins, birds resting on snowy branches, and one unfinished watercolor of a frozen lake glowing beneath the northern sky. They were surprisingly gentle. Logan noticed where I was looking but did not rush to explain. "I started drawing a few years ago," he said quietly. "Mostly on days when the trails are closed." I stared at the sketches, struggling to connect them with the boy who once seemed to enjoy making other people feel invisible. Before I could respond, a faint thump echoed from the back porch. Logan immediately set his mug down and opened the door. A small red fox stood just beyond the steps, its fur dusted with snow as it searched for food beneath the drifting white. Logan crouched several feet away, speaking so softly I could barely hear him. The fox watched him for a long moment before trotting calmly back into the trees. "They have been having a rough winter," Logan said after closing the door. "Sometimes all they need is a quiet place to pass through." His words lingered with me longer than they should have. I found myself wondering whether he had been talking only about the fox or about people too. That evening, after another peaceful dinner, I noticed something unusual. Long after the fire had burned low, Logan remained awake, sitting alone beside the front window with a blanket around his shoulders, staring into the endless snowfall as though he had been waiting years for someone who never quite arrived. The third morning arrived wrapped in an eerie stillness. The wind had finally surrendered, leaving the forest covered beneath a blanket of untouched white that sparkled beneath the weak winter sun. It should have felt peaceful, yet something about the silence seemed heavier than the storm itself. Logan had already gone outside to inspect the generator, leaving me alone inside the cabin with nothing but the crackling fireplace and my own restless thoughts. I wandered from room to room, tracing my fingers along shelves filled with books, framed photographs of mountain trails, and hand-carved wooden animals that looked as though they had been shaped during long evenings exactly like these. None of it matched the person I remembered. I kept waiting to discover something that would prove the gentleman I had met over the past 2 days was only pretending. Instead, every corner of the cabin seemed to tell the same quiet story. Responsibility, patience, solitude. While searching for another log to place on the fire, I noticed a weathered wooden box tucked beneath a side table. It was not hidden, only forgotten. As I reached for another piece of firewood, the box shifted slightly and its lid eased open just enough for a folded photograph to slide onto the floor. Instinctively, I bent down and picked it up. It was our senior class picture. Younger faces smiled beneath bright spring sunlight, frozen forever in a moment none of us could revisit. My eyes found myself almost immediately, standing near the edge of the group with an awkward smile I barely recognized. Then I noticed another face. Logan. A handwritten circle surrounded my picture, drawn with faded blue ink. My pulse quickened. Before I could understand why, several folded envelopes slipped from inside the box. Every one of them had my name written carefully across the front. Caleb Foster. None had ever been opened. None had ever been mailed. I stared at the oldest envelope, my fingers suddenly trembling. Before I could stop myself, I unfolded the first letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained steady. I am not asking you to forgive me. I only need you to know that I think about what I did almost every day. I kept reading, unable to look away. There was no excuse, no attempt to rewrite the past. Only honest regret from someone who seemed to understand exactly how much damage careless words could leave behind. Another letter spoke about seeing classmates laugh while pretending everything was fine. Another admitted that growing older had forced him to recognize how fear and insecurity had shaped the person he became. One sentence lingered in my mind longer than all the others. I wish I had been brave enough to be kind when it mattered most. The front door opened softly behind me. I turned to find Logan standing perfectly still, snow melting from his boots as his eyes settled on the letters scattered across the floor. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Embarrassment crossed his face before he quietly removed his gloves. "I should have thrown those away years ago," he said. I looked back at the stack. "Why did you keep them?" His answer came almost as a whisper. "Because I never earned the right to send them." The room felt impossibly quiet. Even the fire seemed to crackle more gently. Logan walked over, but he stopped several feet away, leaving enough space for me to decide whether I wanted him any closer. "After graduation, I tried finding you," he continued. "I heard you moved away. I wrote those letters whenever I thought maybe I finally had the words. Then I realized words alone were not enough." He lowered his eyes for a second before meeting mine again. "The person you knew back then was someone I have spent years trying not to become again." I searched his face for the arrogance I remembered, but all I found was a kind of sadness that could not be rehearsed. For the first time since the storm had forced us together, I realized the hardest thing about facing my past was not remembering who Logan used to be. It was accepting that he might truly be someone else now. That night, the mountain reminded us that winter was not finished yet. Just after sunset, the lights flickered twice before the cabin fell into darkness. The steady hum of the heater disappeared, replaced by the low whistle of wind squeezing through the trees outside. Logan reached for a flashlight without the slightest sign of panic. "The backup generator sometimes needs a manual reset during heavy snow," he said calmly. "Stay inside. I will be back in a few minutes." I watched him disappear into the storm, his flashlight becoming a tiny golden dot before the snowfall swallowed it completely. The cabin suddenly felt much larger than it had before. Every creak of old wood echoed through the darkness. The windows reflected only my own silhouette against endless black. I told myself I was 31 years old, not the frightened teenager I had once been, but memory does not care how many birthdays have passed. There had been a winter afternoon during my sophomore year when several classmates thought it would be funny to lock me inside the equipment storage room behind the school gym. I remembered the darkness, the cold, the sound of everyone walking away while I pounded on the door until my voice disappeared. I had never liked small spaces after that day. I had simply learned how to hide it. A loud gust rattled the cabin so hard that one of the kitchen cabinets swung open with a sharp bang. My breathing immediately became uneven. The room seemed smaller. The silence became heavier. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to focus on the faint glow of the fireplace, but every shadow looked deeper than the last. Minutes later, the front door opened, letting in a burst of icy air as Logan stepped back inside, brushing snow from his jacket. One look at my face was enough for him to understand something was wrong. He did not rush toward me. He did not ask too many questions. He quietly restarted the generator before placing another log onto the fire. Warm light slowly returned to the cabin, yet the tightness inside my chest refused to leave. Logan remained several feet away, lowering himself into the rocking chair across from mine instead of sitting beside me. His voice stayed gentle, almost careful. "You do not have to explain anything." I stared into the flames, embarrassed by how obvious my fear must have been. "I hate the dark," I admitted quietly. "Not because of the dark itself, Because it reminds me of something. Logan nodded once. You do not have to tell me what happened. Another long silence settled between us, but this one felt different. It was not empty. It was patient. The fire crackled softly while snow brushed against the windows like gentle fingertips. After several minutes, Logan spoke again without looking directly at me. I am staying right here. For simple words. No promises that everything would be fine. No attempt to erase the past. No pressure to talk before I was ready. He simply stayed. We sat there for what felt like an hour, listening to the storm breathe around the cabin. Gradually my heartbeat slowed until I could hear the wind without flinching. At one point I looked up and found Logan quietly reading an old wildlife guide beneath the flashlight resting on the table, giving me the comforting feeling that nothing needed to happen except letting time pass. I realized then that kindness was sometimes almost invisible. It did not arrive with grand speeches or dramatic apologies. Sometimes it looked like someone choosing not to leave when they knew you were afraid. Before heading to bed, I stopped beside the fireplace and looked at Logan. Thank you, I said, the words barely louder than the flames. He smiled softly, not with relief or triumph, but with quiet understanding. You are welcome, Caleb. For the first time since the snowstorm had forced our paths together, the cabin no longer felt like a place where I was trapped. It felt like the first place in years where a part of me had finally started to feel safe. The next morning the mountain greeted us with clear blue skies that looked almost unreal after days of relentless snowfall. Sunlight poured across the endless white landscape, turning every branch into crystal and every frozen field into something that shimmered like glass. The weather radio finally carried encouraging news. Road crews had started clearing the main highway, but they still needed another full day before anyone could safely leave the valley. Strangely, the announcement did not bring the relief I expected. Instead, I caught myself wondering how much quieter the cabin would feel once I drove away. Logan finished his coffee, grabbed his work gloves, and smiled toward the window. Looks like we finally have a chance to clean up before everything freezes again. Without thinking, I reached for my own coat. I will help. This time he did not tell me that I did not have to. We spent the morning clearing the last heavy piles of snow from the porch and cutting a narrow path toward the storage shed. The work was tiring, but it felt honest. Every shovel of snow seemed to uncover a little more ground beneath our feet, just as every quiet conversation uncovered another layer of the people we had become. Logan told me about the years he had spent training to become a forest ranger because the mountains were the only place where he felt he could hear himself think. I admitted that I started teaching art because drawing had always been easier than explaining my feelings out loud. He laughed softly and confessed that he still struggled to paint trees without making them look like oversized broccoli. I laughed harder than I expected, and the sound surprised both of us. It had been years since laughing around Logan felt possible. Around lunchtime, we heard a faint, desperate whimper drifting through the trees. Logan immediately stopped what he was doing and tilted his head, listening carefully. Did you hear that? He asked. A second cry answered from somewhere beyond the snowbank near the edge of the clearing. We carefully followed the sound until we discovered a small border collie tangled beneath low branches where deep snow had trapped it. The frightened dog watched us with cautious eyes but made no attempt to growl or run away. Logan slowly knelt several feet away, keeping his voice calm and steady. Easy, buddy. Nobody is going to rush you. He never reached out too quickly. He simply waited until the dog decided it was safe enough to come closer. Watching him, I realized this was exactly how he had treated me since I arrived. Patient, gentle, never demanding trust before I was ready to offer it. Eventually the dog limped free from the branches and cautiously accepted a piece of beef jerky from Logan's gloved hand. Together we wrapped it in an old blanket and brought it back to the cabin, where it happily devoured a bowl of water and dog food that Logan somehow always kept on hand for wandering animals. The little dog curled up beside the fireplace with a satisfied sigh that filled the room with unexpected warmth. You keep supplies ready for strangers, I observed. Logan shrugged modestly. Out here everyone depends on someone eventually. Sometimes it is a hiker. Sometimes it is an animal. Sometimes it is two people stuck in a snowstorm. His words settled quietly between us. I found myself studying the man sitting across from me, searching for the teenager I had once feared. He seemed impossibly far away now. That evening I picked up one of the sketchbooks from the coffee table and handed it back to him. "Your drawings are getting better," I said with a teasing smile. Logan raised one eyebrow. "Even the broccoli trees?" I laughed again. "Especially the broccoli trees." He laughed with me, and for the first time our smiles arrived at exactly the same moment. Somewhere between clearing snow, rescuing a lost dog, and sharing ordinary conversations, I finally understood something I had never considered before. People do not prove they have changed by asking to be believed. They prove it quietly, one ordinary day at a time. The following morning arrived with the sound I had almost forgotten existed. Snowplows. Their distant engines echoed through the valley like a promise that the world beyond the mountains was finally waking up again. Logan stepped onto the porch with a small handheld radio, while I stood beside the kitchen window holding a mug of hot chocolate. After listening for several moments, he turned toward me with a quiet smile that somehow carried both relief and disappointment. "The highway should reopen by this afternoon," he said. I nodded automatically, yet the words settled strangely inside me. For days I had counted every hour until I could leave. Now that the moment had finally arrived, I found myself staring at the falling snowflakes with unexpected hesitation. We spent the morning packing my art supplies into the Forest Service truck so we could retrieve my SUV once the road crews finished clearing the shoulder. Neither of us spoke very much. The easy conversations from the day before had been replaced by the quiet awareness that our unexpected time together was coming to an end. Even the little border collie seemed to notice. It wandered back and forth between us, happily carrying an old tennis ball while refusing to choose which human deserved its attention more. Around noon, Logan received confirmation that my vehicle could safely be reached. We drove through towering walls of snow left behind by the plows until we found my SUV exactly where I had abandoned it. The battery needed a jump, but the engine started after only a few tries. I smiled with relief as the familiar rumble filled the cold afternoon air. "Looks like you are free," Logan said. There was no sadness in his voice, no hidden request for me to stay longer, only genuine happiness that I could continue my trip safely. Somehow that made leaving even harder. We drove back to the cabin one final time so I could gather the last of my belongings. The living room looked exactly as it had when I first arrived, yet everything felt different now. The fire still glowed softly. My empty mug still rested beside the fireplace. The sketchbook Logan had shown me remained on the coffee table, open to the unfinished watercolor of the frozen lake. It felt impossible that only a few days earlier I had stepped into this cabin convinced I knew exactly who he was. Outside, I loaded the final box into my SUV, while Logan quietly checked that my tires had enough traction for the drive down the mountain. When he finished, he stepped back and brushed the snow from his gloves. "You should leave before sunset," he said. "The roads are clear now, but temperatures will drop again tonight." I looked at him, waiting for him to say something more. Perhaps another apology. Perhaps a confession. Instead, he simply placed his hands inside his jacket pockets and smiled with the same quiet kindness he had shown me since the first night. "Caleb," he said softly, "you never owed me forgiveness. If driving away makes your life lighter, then I hope you never think about me again." Those words landed far deeper than any apology could have. There was no expectation hidden inside them, no attempt to earn redemption. He was giving me complete freedom to leave without carrying the weight of his hopes. I climbed into my SUV and started the engine. As I slowly pulled away from the cabin, I glanced into the rearview mirror one last time. Logan remained standing on the porch beneath the pale winter sky, one hand resting lightly against the wooden railing, while the little border collie sat faithfully beside him. Neither of them moved. They simply watched until the distance softened their outlines against the snow. Somewhere along the winding mountain road, I realized something that stopped feeling like a thought and started feeling like the truth. When I pictured Logan now, I no longer saw the boy who had made school hallways feel lonely. I saw The man who had stayed beside a fire until my breathing steadied, who had waited patiently for trust instead of demanding it, and who had quietly become the safest part of a storm I would never forget. I had driven less than 3 miles when I pulled onto a scenic overlook carved into the side of the mountain. The engine continued humming beneath the hood, but my hands refused to leave the steering wheel. Ahead of me, the valley stretched beneath a brilliant winter sky, untouched snow glowing beneath the afternoon sun as though the storm had never existed. A few days earlier, I would have given anything to escape that mountain. Now every mile between me and the cabin felt strangely heavier than the last. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes, replaying every quiet moment that had filled the past several days. Logan making pancakes because he remembered I never liked coffee. Logan waiting beside the fireplace without asking questions. Logan writing letters he never believed he deserved to send. Logan releasing me without asking for anything in return. Somewhere between those memories, another realization quietly settled into my heart. I had spent years believing forgiveness meant pretending the past never happened. But that was never what forgiveness truly was. It was choosing not to let old pain decide every tomorrow. Before I could overthink it, I shifted the SUV into reverse. Snow crunched beneath the tires as I turned around and headed back toward the cabin. Every curve in the road felt lighter than the one before it. When the familiar wooden porch finally appeared between the pines, Logan was exactly where I had left him. He stood near the porch steps repairing a loose railing while the little border collie chased snowflakes across the yard. He looked up as my SUV rolled to a stop. Surprise crossed his face so honestly that it made me smile before I even stepped outside. For a moment, neither of us moved. The mountain breeze carried only the sound of distant birds and melting snow dripping from the roof. I walked toward him slowly until only a few feet separated us. Logan searched my face, clearly uncertain whether something had gone wrong with the road. "Did your vehicle break down again?" he asked. I shook my head.
No.
"Did they close the highway?"
No.
He waited quietly, giving me the same patience he had shown since the day we met again. I let out a slow breath that seemed to carry years of fear with it. I came back because I realized I was driving away from the wrong thing. His blue eyes softened, but he still said nothing. I appreciated that more than he probably knew. Finally, I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "You once told me to stay close because the trail disappeared in the storm." Logan nodded gently. "I remember. I think I finally understand what you meant." The corners of his mouth lifted into the smallest smile. After a quiet moment he asked, almost carefully, "Can I stay close?" There was no pressure hidden inside the question. No expectation. Only hope offered with complete respect for whatever answer I chose. I stepped the final distance between us and laughed softly. "Only if you promise never to disappear behind silence again." Logan smiled fully then, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and erased years of regret without pretending those years had never existed. He agreed with a simple, heartfelt promise. We stood together beneath the bright winter sky while snow slipped gently from the pine branches around us. The little border collie happily circled our boots before settling beside us with a contented sigh. Nothing about the moment felt dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no perfect endings, only two people willing to begin something honest. As we walked back toward the warm cabin side by side, I realized that sometimes the bravest journey is not leaving the past behind. Sometimes it is turning around, taking one step back toward someone who has truly changed, and allowing your own heart to change with them. 1 year later, the mountain looked different, or perhaps I was the one who had changed. The same pine trees still swayed gently in the breeze, the same winding roads curved through the valley, and every winter the snow returned with quiet certainty. But now, when I drove toward Logan's cabin, I no longer arrived as someone haunted by old memories. I arrived home. The small building had grown busier over the past 12 months. Together we had transformed the unused community hall in the nearby town into a weekend art center where children and teenagers could paint, draw, sculpt, and simply exist without worrying about fitting in. Some of them were shy. Some had recently moved to the area. Others carried invisible worries they could not yet explain. We never asked them to tell us everything. We simply handed them brushes, fresh paper, and the time to discover their own voices. Logan built wooden easels in the evenings while I taught watercolor classes every Saturday morning. The little border collie, whom we eventually named Aspen, greeted every visitor with unstoppable enthusiasm and somehow convinced even the quietest children to smile before class began. One snowy afternoon, a young boy lingered after everyone else had gone home. He stared at a half-finished painting before quietly asking, "Do people ever stop being mean?" The question settled over the room with surprising weight. I looked at Logan across the studio. He met my eyes for only a second before returning to sweep dried paint from the floor, trusting me to answer in my own way. I knelt beside the boy and smiled gently. "Some people do," I said. "The important thing is that kindness can grow too. Sometimes it grows even faster." The boy nodded thoughtfully before adding one more streak of blue across his winter sky. As he left, Logan walked over carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate, handing one to me exactly the way he had on that first evening in the cabin. "You are getting good at that," he said. I laughed. "Teaching art." He shook his head. "Helping people believe tomorrow can be different." I looked around the quiet studio filled with colorful paintings drying on every wall. There were landscapes, family portraits, clumsy snowmen, impossible rainbows, and one mountain painted bright purple because a little girl insisted mountains should be allowed to have fun too. Every picture was imperfect. Every picture mattered, much like the people who created them. As the sun dipped behind the snowy peaks, Logan reached for my hand with the same quiet respect that had always defined him. There was no urgency, no need to prove anything to the world. Just 2 lives moving forward together one ordinary day at a time. Looking back now, I realized the storm had never truly been about getting stranded on a mountain. It had been about discovering that healing often arrives in unexpected places, carried by patience instead of promises, by steady actions instead of perfect words. I once believed home was a destination waiting somewhere beyond the next highway. I was wrong. Home was never a place on a map. Home was the person who stayed beside the fire when fear returned. Home was the voice that never rushed my healing. Home was the quiet courage to forgive without forgetting and to trust without pretending the past had never existed. If this story has taught me anything, it is that people are not forever defined by their worst mistakes, and neither are we forever defined by our deepest wounds. Hearts can change. Lives can change. And sometimes the coldest winter becomes the season that quietly leads us toward the warmest beginning of all.